In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful. It is my pleasure to be with you here today to speak about the Quran. Unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit abbreviated because I have to leave to the airport as soon as we're done here. But actually, my own experience with the Quran is what led me to eventually become a Muslim. And so that is why it takes me, I get great pleasure to speak in particular to non-Muslims about the Quran and try to introduce them to the Quran so that maybe they can share some of the same experiences and the same feelings that I had towards the Quran. So I came from I'm American, traditional American, I guess, Christian background. And so when I started to read and study about Islam, that was the background that I was coming from. And so there are many aspects of the Quran that affected me in many ways. And one of the first aspects that I think is very important has to do with the preservation of the Quran. Because if we're going to speak about following, if we're going to say that we believe in God and we agree upon the fact that we believe in God, and even if we accept the fact or the concept of revelation from God, and if we want to follow this revelation, one of the first and most important aspects is that we have to have a strong reason to believe that this revelation has actually been preserved from its original source. It does not make any sense, really, to say that I'm going to follow God's revelation when we realize or when we know that what we're holding in our hands perhaps has not been preserved. Or we may have good reason to believe that it hasn't been preserved. So one of the first things that stuck out to me with respect to the Quran has to do with the preservation of the Quran. The Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for over a period of 23 years. And actually I don't have, well, they have copies of it outside, so you can see the size of it. And so this book was passed on by the Prophet Muhammad to his followers, and it has been preserved minutely since that time to this day. And as a non-Muslim reading about Islam, I was somewhat surprised by how many of the non-Muslims, many of them who were not very polite in their writings to Islam, if I may use a politically correct way of describing their stance, but even they admitted and they accepted the fact that the Quran that we have today is actually the Quran that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. Well, they didn't say that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. It was the Quran that the Prophet Muhammad taught or passed on to his companions over 1400 years ago. And as I said, this was a very significant point with respect to me, because I had actually studied the history of the Bible before that time. And I'm obviously not going to get into the details of that kind of discussion here. But I can just say that the history of the Quran is completely different from the history of the Bible. And from the earliest days, this Quran was known and recognized and preserved. It was not compiled by later councils, some hundreds or 200s or 300 years ago, later, after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So this is one thing that stood out to me, and as I said, this was of great significance to me, in the sense that, as I said, if we're going to follow something that comes from God, then we have to make sure that what we have is actually that thing that has come from God. And then with respect to the teachings of the Quran also, and what the Quran contains. One of the aspects of the Quran is the fact that throughout the Quran, God is telling human beings to think and to ponder. And the thing that God is calling mankind to in the Quran is, as the Muslim scholars say, it is actually something that is consistent with their nature. It is something understandable to the human being, because this is actually the nature the natural way that human beings have been created. And so therefore God throughout the Quran tells you to ponder over the creation and think about things. And this call and this argument, the conclusion of it, is that you will recognize the fact that there's actually only one Creator, and that this Creator is deserving of worship and so forth. And so therefore there's no, so to speak, leap of faith in Islam. The definition of faith in Islam from an Islamic perspective, from a Quranic perspective, is not to believe in something that you cannot prove. Many people in the West, when they think of faith, they're talking about believing something that is a mystery or something that you cannot prove and so forth. This is not the way of the Quran. The Quran is calling people to a truth that they can recognize, a truth that they can understand. And as I said, the Muslim scholars explain this by the fact that this truth is actually what their whole nature is all about. This is what their soul is seeking.
Allah said about His ability to return us back to life perfectly on the day of resurrection. Yes, we are able to fashion in perfect order the very tips of His fingers. 1400 years ago, some people wondered why God chose to mention the fingertips instead of mentioning something more complicated like the kidney or the eye. Today, science proved that this part of the body is one of the most complicated parts because it is carrying a unique fingerprint. Allah said in the Quran, "Whoever Allah guides, He opens his heart for Islam. And whoever He lets go astray, He makes his chest constrain as if he is ascending gradually in the sky." 14 centuries ago, who could have known that as a man ascends gradually in the sky, oxygen decreases, leading to the feeling of chest tightness? These must be the words of the Creator, Allah.
So the fact that the Quran was continually calling people to think and to ponder, and giving them
Professor Moore was also elected to the membership of the Royal Medical Association of Canada, the International Academy of Cytology, the Union of the American Anatomists, and the Union of North and South American Anatomists. Professor Moore has published many books on clinical anatomy and embryology. 8 of them are used as reference works in medical schools and have been translated into 6 languages, namely Italian, German, Portuguese, Spanish, Greek, and Chinese.
It has been a great pleasure for me to help clarify statements in the Quran about human development. It is clear to me that these statements must have come to Muhammad from God or Allah, because almost all of this knowledge was not discovered until many centuries later. This proves to me that Muhammad must have been a messenger of God or Allah.
Summary. The Quran describes not only the development of external form, but emphasizes also the internal stages, the stages inside the embryo of its creation and development, emphasizing major events recognized by contemporary science. Thank you for your attention.
As a scientist, I can only deal with things which I can specifically see. I can understand embryology and developmental biology. I can understand the words that are translated to me from the Quran. As I gave the example before, if I were to transpose myself into that era, knowing what I do today and describing things, I could not describe the things which were described. I see no reason, I see no evidence for the fact to refute the concept that this individual, Muhammad, had to be developing this information from someplace. So I see nothing here in conflict with the concept that divine intervention was involved in what he was able.
I find it very interesting that this sort of information is in the ancient scriptures of the Holy Quran, and I have no way of knowing where they would come from, but I think it is extremely interesting that they are there and that this work is going on to discover the meaning of some of the passages. Well, I would think it must be the divine being.
Muhammad was a very ordinary man. He couldn't have read, he didn't know to write. In fact, he was illiterate. And we're talking about 1,200 years ago. You have someone, a literate person, making profound pronouncements and statements that are amazingly accurate of a scientific nature. And I personally can't see how this could be a mere chance. There are too many accuracies. And like Dr. Moore, I have no difficulty in my mind reconciling that this is a divine inspiration or revelation which led him to these statements.
Thinking of many of these questions and thinking where Muhammad came from, he was after all a Bedouin. I think it is almost impossible that he could have known about things like the common origin of the universe, because scientists have only found out within the last few years, with very complicated and advanced technological methods, that this is the case. Somebody who did not know something about nuclear physics 1,400 years ago could not, I think, be in a position to find out from his own mind, for instance, that the earth and the heavens had the same origin, or many other of the questions that we have discussed here.
In a relatively few ayah is contained a rather comprehensive description of human development from the time of commingling of the gametes through organogenesis. No such distinct and complete record of human development, such as classification, terminology, and description, existed previously. In most, if not all instances, this description antedates by many centuries the recording of the various stages of human embryonic and fetal development recorded in the traditional scientific literature.
Actually, I'm very much impressed by finding true astronomical facts in Quran. And for us, we modern astronomers have been studying very small fields of the universe. We concentrated our efforts for understanding of very small parts, because by using telescope, we can see only a very few parts of the sky without thinking whole the universe. So by reading Quran and by answering to your questions, I think I can find my future way for investigation of the universe.